The Case of Aron. Sandor Ferenczi's Radical Experiment in Psychoanalysis by Christopher Fortune. Late in the summer of 1924, a troubled 44-year-old American woman named Elizabeth Severn stepped off the train in Budapest's Keleti station. She took a horse-drawn cab to 3 Nagy Diófa, where she climbed the spiral staircase to the third-floor apartment of the world-famous Hungarian psychoanalyst Sandor Ferenczi, M.D. Ferenczi, she believed, was her last hope, the only person who could cure her desperate mental state and save her life. Ferenczi, 51 years old, known for his success with other analysts' incurables, ushered her into his consulting room. So began an unprecedented 8-year therapeutic relationship that radically expanded the bounds of psychoanalysis. 60 years after this momentous meeting, Sandor Ferenczi's 1932 clinical diary was published. Its pages were filled with references to the patient Aron, Ferenczi's codename for Elizabeth Severn. The diary establishes this woman's profound influence in Ferenczi's final radical challenge to classical psychoanalysis and to Freud himself. On the basis of original research, Ferenczi's diary and Severn's own writings 3, I have been able to clarify Elizabeth Severn's identity, her therapeutic relationship with Ferenczi, and her critical significance in the development of his last controversial ideas currently being reassessed by contemporary psychoanalysis. Elizabeth Severn's case and her analytic relationship with Ferenczi is a historical missing link, an unacknowledged paradigm case. Fortune, 1991. A pivotal point in the history and development of psychoanalysis in the tradition of Anna O. and Dora. Not only was Severn the catalyst for Ferenczi's recognition of the clinical significance of countertransference, Wallstan 1989-1990, but, I argue, she was a critical factor precipitating his return to Freud's trauma theory. Fortune, 1991. From the mid-1920s, Elizabeth Severn, described by Ferenczi as his principal patient, colleague, and, finally, his teacher, influenced his revolutionary technical innovations, including activity, elasticity, passivity, and relaxation. Specifically, Severn initiated Ferenczi's most notorious therapeutic experiment, his recently revealed mutual analysis, Ferenczi, 1932. This radical departure from analytic neutrality led directly to his prescient understanding of the dynamics of early sexual trauma, including his own, an understanding that bolstered his challenge to Freud and the cornerstone of psychoanalysis unconscious fantasy, Ferenczi, 1932-1933. In fact, Elizabeth Severn may have been the first sexually abused analysand, whose actual childhood trauma was the focus of psychoanalytic treatment since Freud abandoned his seduction theory in the late 1890s. Fortune, 1991. On May 29, 1933, a week after Ferenczi's death, in a letter to Ernest Jones, Freud analyzed his longtime friend and assessed Ferenczi's loss to the psychoanalytic movement. Freud's hurt is palpable. In his analysis, he disparaged Ferenczi as a weak, misguided child, partly turned away from him and psychoanalysis by the suspect, Elizabeth Severn. Freud wrote, Ferenczi held the conviction that I did not love him enough, that I did not want to recognize his works, and that I had badly analyzed him. His innovations in technique were connected with this, since he wanted to show me how lovingly one must treat one's patients in order to help them. In fact, these were regressions to the complexes of his childhood. He would himself become a better mother, and in fact found the children he needed. Among them was a suspect American woman, to whom he devoted 4 or 5 hours a day, Mrs. Severn. When she left, he believed that she could influence him through vibrations sent across the ocean. He said that she analyzed him and thereby saved him. So he played both roles, was both the mother and the child. She seems to have produced in him a pseudologia fantastica, since he believed her accounts of the most strange childhood traumas, which he then defended against us. In these disorders was snuffed out his once so brilliant intelligence. But let us preserve his sad exit as a secret among ourselves. Freud to Jones, in Masson, 1984, pages 180 to 181, italics added. Jones, 1957, was undoubtedly referring to Severn when he wrote that Freud called a certain woman Ferenczi's evil genius, page 407. See also Fortune, 1991-5. The secret of Ferenczi's sad exit has been kept for nearly 60 years. As Roazen, 1975, commented, as yet we do not have an explanation of the reference to an American woman p. 371. In order to understand the historical and contemporary significance of Ferenczi's final work, however, we must now lift this veil of secrecy shrouding his relationship with Elizabeth Severn. Who is Elizabeth Severn, and how did she come to be vilified by Freud as the wicked architect of Ferenczi's demise? Background. Elizabeth Severn was born Leota Brown, November 17, 1879, and grew up in a small town in the Midwest United States. Leota was a sickly child, plagued with fears and anxieties. Chronically fatigued and bedridden, she suffered from violent headaches, eating disorders, and frequent nervous breakdowns throughout her teenage and early adult years. She took the cures prescribed for her symptoms, probably diagnosed as neurasthenia Lutz, 1991, and spent time in the mountains of Colorado, as well as taking periodic retreats in mental sanatoriums. Relief, however, was always temporary. By the turn of the century, Leota had married. In 1901, at the age of 22, she gave birth to her only child, a daughter named Margaret. In 1905, Leota's marriage ended. The following year, in the aftermath of a major breakdown, she put herself under the care of a psychologically oriented MD whose practice incorporated the power of positive thinking with a theosophical turn. M. Severn, Personal Communication, July, 1989. On April 18, 1907, emerging from her treatment, the 27-year-old Leota wrote to her mother that she had discovered her calling. "I am going to work now to become a healer myself. There is no question but that I have the power. It would be the delight of my life to help people in that way." Unpublished letter from collection of M. Severn. Destitute, yet determined to start a new life, Leota gathered up her daughter, took the train to Texas, obtained a divorce, and legally changed her name to Elizabeth Severn. She sold encyclopedias door to door and, to her surprise, found that people sought her advice on their personal problems, advice that she freely gave, although she sold few books. Taking this as a sign, she set up an office in a local hotel room, made up business cards reading Elizabeth Severn, metaphysician, and began seeing patients. Using mental therapeutics and her psychic, healing touch, she claimed to have effected a number of dramatic cures, including a brain tumor. Severn, 1913. In 1912, Elizabeth and her daughter, Margaret, sailed for England, where she set up a psychotherapy practice in London. In 1913, Severn published her first book, Psychotherapy, Its Doctrine and Practice, using her cases to illustrate the power of positive thinking, will dreams, visualization, and telepathic healing. Although lacking any formal academic or professional credentials, she identified herself as Elizabeth Severn, Ph.D. On May 8, 1914, in London, Severn was elected honorary vice president of the Alchemical Society and delivered the evening's keynote address, later published as an article, Some Mystical Aspects of Alchemy, Severn, 1914. 6. In the fall of 1914, with the outbreak of World War I, mother and daughter retreated to New York, where for the next 10 years Elizabeth Severn practiced psychotherapy, initially renting a Fifth Avenue hotel suite as her consulting room. While on the surface Severn appeared to be a resourceful, confident, and successful woman who put into practice her own methods based on willpower, throughout this period she suffered chronic, often debilitating, psychological and physical symptoms, including confusion, hallucinations, nightmares, and severe depression, which often left her suicidal. In despair, she consulted various doctors, including a number of psychiatrists. She also consulted analyst Otto Rank, who had recently arrived from Europe. All were unsuccessful in influencing her difficult pathology. By mid-1924, considered a hopeless case, Severn found her way to the analyst of last resort, Budapest's Sandor Ferenczi. Budapest between the wars should have been a lively and rich cultural experience for an American woman on her own. However, although Severn lived in an airy two-room suite at the Cosmopolitan Hotel Ritz, the Dunapolota, Danube Palace, she kept herself apart socially and professionally. She did not participate in the Hungarian Psychoanalytical Society or in any analytic circle. She was a loner and remained one throughout her life. "My mother was a one-woman show," her daughter recalled. She had no friends or colleagues, only patients. M. Severn, Personal Communication, July 24, 1991. In fact, 4 or 5 devoted and financially well-off American patients followed Severn to Budapest to continue therapy with her. The analysis. Elizabeth Severn was in analysis with Ferenczi in Budapest for several months in the fall of 1924. At first, Ferenczi found Severn unpleasant. In his diary, Ferenczi, 1932, he admits to being anxious and in awe of her, page 97. In his entry for May 5, 1932, recollecting his first impressions of Severn 8 years earlier, Ferenczi wrote, "She had excessive independence and self-assurance, immensely strong willpower as reflected by the marble-like rigidity of her facial features, and, altogether a somewhat sovereign, majestic superiority of a queen, or even the royal imperiousness of a king. All these are characteristics that one certainly cannot call feminine. Threatened and defensive, Ferenczi assumed an attitude of superiority of intrepid masculinity, a conscious professional pose, p. 97. By the end of 1924, Severn had returned to New York and resumed her therapeutic practice. By February 1925, she was back in Budapest and remained there for 10 months. The analysis intensified. In May of that year, a despondent Severn wrote to her daughter that she contemplated throwing herself into the Danube, M. Severn T. Severn, June 3, 1925, 7. In a poetic passage in his diary, Ferenczi, 1932, evoked Severn's daily mental despair. Behind her murdered ego, the ashes of earlier mental sufferings are rekindled every night by the fire of suffering, p. 10. On July 7th, Severn marked Ferenczi's birthday by giving him a gift of her second book, Severn, 1917, inscribing it, "With appreciation to one who can still find fragrance in the garlands of former years, Sandor Ferenczi, from his grateful pupil, Elizabeth Severn." In August, Ferenczi wrote Severn a letter of introduction to Freud, identifying her as Dr. Severn, an American woman and a diligent psychologist who is currently in analysis with me. 8. It is not clear whether there was a particular reason for Ferenczi's introduction. Since Ferenczi admired Severn, J. DuPont, Personal Communication, November 1986, and Freud received many visitors, it may simply have been an act of collegiality. It is also possible that Severn sought a consultation with Freud. Regardless, in October, Severn wrote to Margaret that she had had a cordial interview with Freud. 9. In October 1926, again back in New York after a summer in Budapest, Severn attended Ferenczi's 8-month lecture series, Selected Chapters in the Theory and Practice of Psychoanalysis, at the New School for Social Research. She was also pair of a lay analysis group that he formed during his New York visit. 10. Meanwhile, her own analysis continued. In June 1927, Elizabeth sailed back to Britain with Ferenczi and his wife, Gisela, and carried on to Budapest by way of London, Paris, and Baden-Baden. Despite years of intensive analysis, Severn's case showed little progress. In keeping with his indulgence and elasticity techniques, Ferenczi, 1928, and openly overcompensating, Ferenczi, 1932, wrote, "I redoubled my efforts. Gradually, I gave in to more and more of the patient's wishes." p. 97. A breakthrough Karn in March 1928. Utilizing relaxation and regression techniques and working with trance states, Severn and Ferenczi lifted a veil of early amnesia and began to uncover the missing details of Elizabeth's childhood and fragmented self. M. Severn T. Severn, March 30th, 1928, M. Severn Collection. They pieced together a picture of severe early abuse that Severn's father had physically, emotionally, and sexually abused her from the age of 1.5. The recovered unconscious memories were horrendous and bizarre. They included Severn's image of having been forced, when she was older, to participate in the murder of a black man. Ferenczi, 1932, later wrote in his diary of R. N.S. extraordinary, incessant protestations that she is no murderer, although she admits to firing the shots. p. 17. The analysis deepened. Ferenczi and Severn remained incredulous as material that is even more appalling emerged, not only murder and mutilation, but also Elizabeth's experience of being drugged, poisoned, and prostituted to other men. A few years later, recording the case history of RN in his clinical diary, Ferenczi wrote that Severn had made a precarious psychological adaptation to her apparently unbearable childhood situation. He theorized that she had established a fragile equilibrium of 3 split psychic fragments. However, he wrote, this tenuous grip on reality was shattered when she was 11-2 years old and her father deserted the family. As a farewell gesture, her father had inflicted a final horrific shock upon Severn. He had cursed the child, wrote Ferenczi, which left her in a state of psychic disintegration, with severe amnesia, pages 8 to 10. In shock, analyst and patient grappled with the central question that often plagues the therapeutic reconstruction and remembering of early childhood trauma. Could they believe these enigmatic memories in all their graphic details? Ferenczi wrote in his diary that each repetition of the trauma in the analysis ended with Severn's statement, "And still I don't know if the whole thing is true." p. 98. Seeking objective verification, Severn questioned her mother, hired lawyers to investigate her past, and even considered digging for the remains of the corpse. Establishing the reality of the traumatic shocks became the focus of the analysis. As this nightmare erupted into consciousness, Elizabeth Severn's condition became acute. She was already Ferenczi's most demanding and difficult patient. By 1928, driven by what Freud called his Furor Sanandi, rage to cure, Ferenczi was regularly seeing her twice a day for a total of 4 to 5 hours, as well as on weekends and, if necessary, at night. Severn was often too ill to get out of bed, except to see her own patients, so Ferenczi reminiscent of the young Freud treating Anna von Lieben, Frau Casseli M. Swales, 1986, analyzed her in her rooms at the Dunapolota. In July, Ferenczi wrote to his close friend and doctor, analyst George Grodek, a particularly difficult case, undoubtedly Severn, which could not follow me to Germany was the principal reason we, Sandor and Gazella, did not visit you this time. Dupont et al., 1982, page 111. However, when possible, he continued Severn's analysis during vacations abroad 11. In late September 1928, responding to her insistence not to interrupt the treatment, Ferenczi allowed Severn to accompany him and Gazella on their vacation to Spain. Not surprisingly, Ferenczi's attentive ministrations convinced Severn that she had found her perfect lover, Ferenczi, 1932, page 98. Faced with this turn of events, Ferenczi took fright and retreated, all the while interpreting for Severn the negative emotions that she ought to have felt toward him. Severn countered with identical interpretations, which Ferenczi had to concede were justified, p. 20. In 1929, from late June until August, Severn lodged at the Schweizerhof Hotel in St. Moritz, Switzerland, with Ferenczi and his other patients/students, including a number of Americans, mainly women. Among them were psychoanalytic notables Clara Thompson and Izette de Forest, both mentioned in Ferenczi's diary, who were in analysis with Ferenczi in Budapest in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and who had met that summer in the mountain resort of St. Moritz. At summer's end, Ferenczi wrote to Grodek that Severn was in a critical phase and asked if he could bring her to Grodek Sanatorium in Baden-Baden, Ferenczi and Grodek, 1982, page 117. Grodek agreed. In October, back in Budapest, Ferenczi wrote to Grodek, "I am afraid the patients are literally trying to overwhelm me." Ferenczi and Grodek, 1982, page 118. At the Oxford Congress in August, Ferenczi, 1929, had introduced the notions of psychotic splitting and dissociation, for which he acknowledged his debt to discoveries made by our colleague, Elizabeth Severn, which she personally communicated to me, pages 121 to 122. In June 1930, Severn's condition deteriorated. She lapsed into periodic comas and could not look after herself. Alarmed, Ferenczi admitted her to a sanatorium near Budapest. Concerned by Severn's grave state and anxious that she might not pull through, Ferenczi cabled Margaret Severn to come from New York to be with her mother. He offered to waive his own analytical fee if it would enable her to remain in Budapest. Margaret responded immediately and stayed 4 months. While Severn was in this state of collapse, Ferenczi wrote to Grodek and Freud about his own failing health, caused in part by the demanding analysis of Elizabeth Severn. Later that year, on December 21st, in a more optimistic mood, Ferenczi again wrote to Grodek. "My principal patient, the Queen, takes up 4, sometimes 5 hours of my time daily. Exhausting but worthwhile. I believe I will shortly, or in the not-too-distant future, be an A. Position finally, to announce what it means to complete an analysis, Dupont et al., 1982, page 122. Did Ferenczi hope to cure Severn, to prove to Freud and the psychoanalytic community that his new techniques were effective and to convince them that actual trauma was the critical etiological factor in neurosis? In his 1931 paper, Child Analysis in the Analysis of Adults, Ferenczi again credited Severn, this time with a perceptive correction to his analytic technique. Severn said, "I sometimes disturb the spontaneity of the fantasy production with my questions and answers. She thought that I ought to confine my assistance to very simple questions instead of statements," pages 133 to 134. Severn, 1933a, herself later claimed to have originated the therapeutic technique on which Ferenczi based his relaxation principia. She wrote that it was a method she devised to induce a trance state. And recollection p. 95.